Well, as we've been hearing, government borrowing and debt are to reach historic proportions. Even on the Chancellor's own figures, stability is the best part of a decade away. Our chief economics correspondent, Hugh Pym, has been looking at how all this is going to be paid back.
Sunny it may have been in many parts of the country today, but the Chancellor's message was we should all expect a big chill on public finances for some years to come. He said the economy would shrink by 3.5% this year, the biggest annual drop in the post-war era. He's banking on growth picking back up again to 3.5 in 2011. That's optimistic. And even if he's right, government borrowing will escalate. Last year he thought he'd need to borrow 120 billion over 4 years. Now he thinks he'll need to raise nearly 600 billion pounds over that time.
I think some people are going to be sceptical that the economy is going to recover quite as quickly as Alistair Darling hopes. But whether it does or doesn't, the key point is that the underlying level of government borrowing is much higher than the government expected back in the end of last year.
Here's an illustration of the scale of the problem. One of Gordon Brown's golden rules was that government debt should be below 40% of annual economic output. For the last couple of years, it has been. This year, including the likely costs of bank bailouts, it's shooting up to 59%. And by 2013, it'll be at nearly 80%. That's almost double the golden rule. Bringing the debt down will affect all of us, either as taxpayers having to fork out more or users of public services which are squeezed because of scarce resources. Today's measures, for example, will hit motorists' wallets with duty increases on fuel above inflation from next year, and that after a 2p a litre rise in September. And we've learned there'll be an even tougher than expected spending clampdown for public services like health from 2011 onwards.
For the next 2 years, the amount of funding is relatively benign. But after that, things are going to get really tough. And it really doesn't matter which government's in power. The health service is going to face a few years of very tight funding.
The government has to borrow from the City of London and foreign investors by issuing bonds known as gilts. Some were not impressed by the Chancellor's latest plans.
We were shocked. We were prepared for big numbers, but not as big as this. The total borrowing amount is large. The amount of gilts is even larger than we thought. We were quite frankly shocked.
Recessions always see borrowing going up. Every leading economy has the same problem. But this time it looks as if a thaw is some way off. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
So Britain's top earners will see their taxes rise and their allowances cut. The measures mark a break with the Tony Blair era and a breach of Labour's last election manifesto. Our political correspondent Joe Coburn reports.
A different Labour Chancellor at number 11 from a different time. Dennis Healey in the 1970s famously said he would tax the rich until the pip squeaked.
I warn you, there are going to be howls of anguish from the 80,000 rich people who are rich enough to pay over 75% on the last slice of their income.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister.
Margaret Thatcher's election in 1979 marked the end of economic consensus and the start of monetarism, and with it the onset of the yuppie decade. The Tory government slashed the 60% top rate of tax down to 40%. After 18 years in the wilderness, Tony Blair was determined to reinvent the Labour Party and woo, not soak the rich. He restated that commitment in the 2005 general election. Today, that key pledge was broken. A new 50% top rate of tax for those earning £150,000 will come into force next April ahead of a general election.
People that earn less money shouldn't be taxed as much. And, you know, if you can afford it, then you should be paying, especially in times like this.
Fairness doesn't necessarily come into it, because life isn't fair, but it's one hell of an incentive not to earn money, isn't it?
I just think they're being penalised to pay for the mistakes that the bankers and everybody else has made.
When Tony Blair and Gordon Brown first came to power 12 years ago, the idea of raising the top rate of income tax would have been thought inconceivable. But times have changed. This isn't a return to old Labour, but it is a return to an old debate, and the government hopes the public will be on its side. The latest Mori opinion poll suggests they might be, with 53% of people saying that higher taxes are preferable to cuts in public services. The Tories have highlighted rising debt levels. They're also determined to avoid Labour's trap of putting themselves on the side of the rich.
We cannot, in all honesty, promise people that we will roll back tax increases that are being announced when we have a huge black hole still to fill.
Visiting an apprentice scheme in London today, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor promised a budget for jobs. But it went much further than that, setting the terms for the next general election. Jo Coburn, BBC News, Westminster.
In a moment, we'll speak to our economics editor, Stephanie